Hello, everyone. I think our speaker is here somewhere. Oh, there he is. Okay. Sorry. Okay, good. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. I'm Mark Duggan, the Trione Director of CEPR, and the Wayne and Jody Cooperman Professor of Economics here at Stanford, and I'm absolutely delighted to have all of you here for today's presentation and conversation with Gita Gopinath, the first Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. I'm really proud that CEPR is co-sponsoring today's event with the Stanford King Center on Global Development and the Hoover Institution. Part of our mission at CEPR is to connect policymakers with academics and students and to involve our broader community in many of these economic policy discussions. And today's event perfectly demonstrates that. The King Center is Stanford's hub for global development, supporting scholars working to address some of the world's most critical problems and training the next generation of leaders in global development. The Hoover Institution is committed to producing and disseminating the highest quality research so that it can contribute to solving problems of governance in free societies, addressing challenges to the values, security, and prosperity of free peoples, and overcoming barriers to the advancement of freedom, liberty, and peace worldwide. So this is a really great alignment of our three organizations' missions and values, and I'm thrilled we can join forces to have Gita with us here today. And a huge thanks to you, Gita, for your time with us at Stanford. I'm so grateful that you were able to meet with students and faculty earlier today, and I'm really looking forward to our session here in a little bit. And today is my last associates event as CEPR director, and I think that we could make a very strong case that we have saved the best for last with the first Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Gita Gopinath, here today. The timing of Gita's visit is especially good with so much happening in the world. The IMF released an update to its World Economic Outlook a few weeks ago, predicting continued growth of about 3.2% this year and next year, along with a continuing decline in inflation. The report said the global economy is surprisingly resilient despite the many changes and that most indicators continue to point to a soft landing. And while there's strong economic performance in the US in terms of employment growth, the report highlights some short and long-term risks that we face here in the US as well. We are, of course, also in an election year, not just in the US, but in many other countries around the world that represent nearly half the world's population. So I'm especially eager to hear Gita's perspective on how so many geopolitical factors and considerations will play out in the global economy. China's bearing on the world economy is top of mind for many of us, and Gita will be heading to China later this month for discussions about the country's economic development and policies, and I'm hoping she can share a bit about how she's approaching those meetings today. And I know we're going to be covering quite a lot of ground in the next hour. And without taking up too much time, allow me to briefly introduce Gita, with the caveat that I could, of course, spend more than an hour talking about her many accomplishments, her influential research, and so forth. But she has served as the IMF's first Deputy Managing Director since January of 2022. In that role, she oversees the work of staff, represents the fund at multilateral forums, maintains high-level contacts with member governments and board members, the media, and other institutions, leads the fund's work on surveillance and related policies, and oversees research and flagship publications. Sounds almost as hard as being CEPR director. She previously served as the chief economist of the fund from 2019 to 2022, and was in charge of 13 releases of the IMF's World Economic Outlook. Before joining the IMF, Gita was the John Zwanstra Professor of International Studies and Economics at Harvard, and before that, she was an assistant professor of economics at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. She has produced an enormously influential body of research during her academic career on a broad set of topics in macroeconomics and international finance, including business cycles, exchange rate pass-through, dollar dominance, and much more. As I said, I could easily fill up the next hour with a summary of her many accomplishments, research contributions, and so forth, but let me end here and ask you, and let you know, let me give you a quick sense of what's going to happen. So she's going to come up here, deliver about 15 to 20 minutes of remarks. I'm going to ask 4 or 5-ish questions, and then open it up for questions from all of you. So please join me. And I'm just sorry, I'm reordering here on the fly. Another big round of thanks to our friends at Hoover and the King Center for making this happen today. And let me end here and ask you to join me in welcoming Gita Gopinath to CEPR.
Thank you. It is a real pleasure to be here. Thank you, Mark, for that kind introduction. And thanks to CEPR, Hoover, and the King Center for hosting me today. So I'm going to talk, as the title says, I'm going to talk about geopolitics and its impact on global trade and the dollar. The International Monetary Fund is a multilateral institution, and one of the things it does is surveillance, which is we look around the world and see whether there are any changing trends in how countries interact with each other. And what we've seen in the last few years, I would say, especially when it comes to global trade relations, is nothing like we've seen since the end of the Cold War. The last few years, you've had numerous shocks, including the pandemic. You had Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And following these events, increasingly, countries around the world are guided by economic security and national security concerns in determining who they trade with and who they invest in. So geopolitical considerations are driving destinations of foreign direct investment increasingly over time. And there are some countries that are also reevaluating their heavy dependence on the dollar. Now, all of this is not necessarily a bad thing. We've certainly learned from the last few years that you cannot take economic resilience for granted. And it's important to build, to make sure that your supply chains are not highly sensitive to which country you're trading with and disruptions that can come with that. So it's important. These are important considerations. You should build economic resilience. The concern, of course, is that the direction of travel, if it is not appropriately controlled, you could end up basically moving dramatically away from a global rules-based trading system, which is what we've lived with for multiple decades now. So I'm going to start with giving you a sense of how far down the path we have come. So this is the global backdrop. If you look at trade restrictions in the world, new trade restrictions, as you can see, 2022 and 2023, each of those years, there were 3,000 new trade restrictions that have been imposed. And that's about 3 times the level that used to be in 2019. So there's been a big increase in the number of trade restrictions. Alongside that, of course, we've had a sharp increase in geopolitical risks. You have the war in Ukraine, the Middle East conflict, all of that shows up in there. Now, so these are measures of restrictions that are being put in the system. A question is this showing up in terms of actually affecting trade flows? And this is this data here. So this is basically looks at a ratio of global trade to world GDP over time. If you look at the end of that chart, it looks fairly flat. So if you look at that chart, you're not going to look at it and say, well, we're seeing signs of deglobalization. It's fairly flat over the last few years, hovering somewhere between 40 and 50%. But there's nothing there that gives you, reason for concern. However, when you look under the hood and you look into who is trading with whom, you see that changing in very significant ways in the last few years. So what we do for that is, at the IMF, we're doing research on this, and we come up with a measure of geopolitical distance across countries. So we use countries' voting patterns at the United Nations and use that as a way of measuring whether which countries are closer to one another politically versus distant from one another politically, right? And so we have a US plus bloc, which is like the US and Europe and some other countries. You have a China plus bloc, and then you have a group of countries in between that you can call a non-aligned bloc. And so what the left graph shows you is that if you look at global trade post-Russia's invasion of Ukraine, global trade as a whole everywhere has declined. Now, it's not because of the war, but for many other reasons, but overall you've seen a decline in global trade. But what's interesting is that you've seen a much sharper decline in trade across blocks of countries as opposed to within geopolitically aligned blocks of countries. And what you see from the right graph is just a more careful estimation of that, which looks at standard determinants of global trade and sees how big a role is geopolitics playing. And the estimates basically say that trade across geopolitically distant countries is about 12% lower than what it is within the blocks. And similarly, foreign direct investment is about 20% lower across blocks as compared to within blocks. So certainly we are seeing the direction of travel in terms of geopolitics playing a more important role in defining who you trade with. So then the question is, why did that previous graph look like nothing was happening? That global trade to GDP was fairly flat. And an important factor behind that is the emergence of so-called connector countries, which is basically the non-aligned set of countries are playing a bigger role in moving goods between, connecting goods that originate in different politically aligned blocks. So for example, if you look at the left graph or the right graph over there, what it's basically saying is that you have countries like Vietnam and Mexico, where the share of exports going from China to these countries have grown, are also those countries whose share going into the US has gone up. So basically, Vietnam and Mexico, it looks like they're playing the role of connector countries where China is trading more with those countries that then end up trading with the US. And you see the same thing in terms of foreign direct investment, which is that China is doing more foreign direct investment in countries like Mexico and Vietnam, whose trade share is growing with the US. So these connector countries are playing an important role. Now, on the plus side, this obviously helps with preventing serious decoupling from happening, maintains some of the efficiency from having all of this trade. But of course, it begs the question of how much true resilience is a country getting when you have connector countries coming in and playing a role. Now, question is, how bad is this fragmentation? So we go back and look at the Cold War, the last time we thought of the world in terms of blocks, I guess. So if you have the Western and Eastern blocks back then, starting from around 1948 or so, and you see what that line shows you, is basically how much trade fell between blocks. The solid blue line is how much trade fell between blocks during the Cold War, and the red is where we are now in terms of time, right? If you compare it to the cumulative drop, it's nothing. What's happening now is fairly small. But of course, there are reasons for concerns because we're still at an early stage, and the question is whether we can prevent going down that road. And there are two other important reasons for concern, which is one was back then, global trade to GDP was around 16%. Now global trade to GDP is 45%. So the cost of decoupling or fragmentation is just that much higher this time around. Second, the 1950s onwards was the time when countries within a bloc, or more geopolitically aligned countries, were actually taking down trade restrictions, while right now we seem to be much more in the environment of just many countries becoming protectionist and looking inwards. The one thing that's better than back then is the economic and diplomatic heft of the non-aligned bloc. Back then, they were very small. They barely had a role in global trade, global supply chains. But the non-aligned bloc is much bigger at this point, and that can help attenuate some of the, the worst-case scenarios. Then, very quickly to the question of what does all of this mean for currency? So this is what we're seeing on trade in terms of goods trade going across borders. Is any of this affecting how countries use different currencies? And what this graph is basically telling you that as if, the bottom line is that the dollar remains the dominant currency. It's about 80% of trade finance. It's now about 60% of foreign currency reserves. There's been a trend decline in the amount of the dollar in FX reserves over time. It used to be 70%. It has come down over time. But most of the diversification is going to kind of non-traditional reserve currencies like the Canadian dollar, the Australian dollar. And yes, there's some to the renminbi, but it's a small fraction. So where, if anything, are we seeing any changes in terms of on the margin? You do see it in trade finance. So if you look at the left graph over there, that again looks at the different blocks, the China block and the US block, to see what's happening in terms of adoption of renminbi in trade finance. And within the US leaning bloc, you really don't see anything. That's not on the slide here, but I'm just telling you, you don't see much at all happening in terms of the US leaning bloc. But in terms of the China bloc, you certainly have seen an increase in the use of the renminbi in trade finance, but starting from a low base. So basically, it's gone up from about 4% to 8% over the last couple of years. The right graph shows that the fact that it's now, China has been moving away for many of its transactions away from the dollar to the renminbi. That graph is from China official sources, and it looks at all cross-border transactions by non-bank institutions. It covers a wide range of transactions, not just trade. And if you look at this, 2010, it was basically zero share of renminbi, and now it's about 50% in its transactions, cross-border transactions. In terms of foreign exchange reserves, especially after the war, like what's the main message? What are we seeing that's different? I think the main message is the growing share of that there are more countries that are building up reserves of gold. Right? So gold is getting more, a higher share in terms of, and it's not just a China story. There are several other countries also who are building up reserves. Again, you don't see it in the US bloc. It's a pretty flat line, but you see it in the China bloc. Right? Now, gold is viewed as being more politically neutral. There are, of course, other benefits too, which is in terms of an inflation hedge. But there is increasing evidence that, again, in an environment of sanctions, there's some diversification happening to other kinds of more neutral reserves like gold. So just very quickly, in terms of implications going forward, which is, of course, we're working on at the fund, which is to estimate what could be the potential impact of all of this. We just know from first principles that trade fragmentation could reduce efficiency gains from specialization, reduces competition and knowledge diffusion, limits economies of scale. And we've come up with estimates of what that could imply. It depends upon the scale of fragmentation that happens. If it's a mild form, then it's a small loss to GDP. World GDP, it's about like 0.2%. But if it becomes a really serious decoupling scenario, then you could end up with losses of about 7% of GDP. So it could get very big, but again, it depends exactly on the extent of fragmentation. What we also do find is concerns around financial fragmentation, obviously, if it's more geopolitically driven foreign direct investment, that's going to affect different countries' ability to attract investment and therefore to build up capital. It weakens risk sharing across countries, and depending upon the extent to which this happens, it can increase macro and financial volatility. We're seeing other kinds of payment systems coming into being used. China has its own cross-border payment system. It's called CIPS. That is believed to play also an important role for why there's so much more renminbi being used in transactions. So we run the risk of having a fragmented global payment system if one is not careful about it. In terms of who gets most affected, emerging and developing economies as a bloc get more affected. Now, there are winners within that bloc. I mean, we talked about Mexico and Vietnam, who can benefit from the fact that countries are looking for new trading partners away from some of their old trading partners. But many developing countries, and especially low-income countries, are at the losing end because they rely very heavily on critical commodities, including food. They import a lot of food. And so in a world where you have more fragmentation, this can pose a problem. And lastly, there are several global public goods for which we need the world to be able to work together, including in terms of climate mitigation. The fact that we have this fragmented environment means that there are critical minerals like copper and lithium, which are geographically concentrated in the world, which are needed for the energy transition. But that trade is not happening to a much lesser extent, and that is also slowing our ability to address challenges on the climate front, and also in terms of bringing countries together to work on AI and so on and so forth. So there are consequences for that. In terms of side on solutions, ideally, and what has helped the world is having a rules-based trading system. So ideally, if we could strengthen the WTO, which would involve fixing a broken dispute resolution mechanism that currently exists. Second, the rules-based trading system will require that we make much more progress on the use of how do we treat the use of subsidies in countries or national security-based arguments. Now, both of those are areas where we've not had very good rules of engagement, but if countries can come together to work on those rules of engagement when it comes to subsidies or national security-based concerns, then we could have progress on that front. But the reality is very far from that, and so the more pragmatic approach is one, first and foremost, just keep open the lines of communication. The US and China are doing that, and Europe and China are doing that, and so just that is one important area to put some guardrails. And the second is you are seeing progress in areas where there is common interest. So for example, when it comes to services trade, everybody agrees that it would be helpful to have more services trade in the world. 90 countries have come together as a part of the WTO to work on improving, removing more restrictions to global trade in digital services. So that's a plus. Similarly, on climate and on food security, in some areas there's progress that's being made. And the last thing we're trying to really caution countries against is the unilateral policy actions we're seeing everywhere in terms of industrial policies, this push to target their own firms and their own industries. Now, to be clear, obviously in the presence of market failures and externalities, there is a role for the government to provide subsidies, but as we've seen historically, it's very hard to make that temporary. It's very hard to contain the fiscal costs, and you can end up with misallocation of resources. So one should move very carefully on that front, and that's what we're also providing when we engage with our countries, we are discussing with them. So overall, just to conclude, I'm an international economist. My job is to look at how countries interact with each other in the global economy, how their decisions spill over, one country's decisions spill over to the rest of the world. That's what the IMF as an institution does. And I do think that we are certainly in an environment where the decisions of who you trade with, who you invest in, all of this is becoming increasingly affected by geopolitics. But again, given how interlinked the world is at this point, I think it's really crucial to make sure that we preserve the big gains that have come from having this kind of economic integration. Yes, we need to build resilience, and that's critical, but we need to have enough guardrails to make sure that you're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Gita. So I'm going to ask some questions, then we'll open it up. So as Gita knows, a few hours ago, I was reminded by one of my CEPR faculty colleagues that I am not an international economist. With that humility, approaching my questions here with some humility, you're at the IMF. Can you just talk a little bit at a high level for this audience? We're 2,500 miles away from the IMF here. What is kind of the IMF trying to do in the world, and what's your role in that? So can you talk a little bit about that?
So, happy to tell you about what the IMF does. It was one of the institutions that was created after the Second World War with a broad aim of having global prosperity and constraining countries from going to war. That would be kind of the meta goal, right? And so the IMF, very simply, is trying to promote macroeconomic and financial stability in the world, right? So what does that mean in terms of what we do? There are three things that we do. The first is a monitoring role, which is we work with our 190 member countries. Every year, we work with them in terms of producing a report on our assessment of their policies, of how their economy is doing, and we have good discussions on what policies can be helpful to address certain problems they may have, or what are the great policies that they have, and we encourage those. So there's that, which is a bilateral surveillance. And the IMF is one of those institutions where countries are, if you're a member of the IMF, you are required to have this kind of an assessment done. So that's one. But then along with the bilateral monitoring, we also do multilateral monitoring, which is we look at trends around the world. We see, is there any risk of a systemic debt crisis building up in the global economy? What I presented is another form of multilateral surveillance that we do. The second thing the IMF does, which it's probably most known for, is being a lender of last resort, which is we have countries in the world that end up in a very difficult financing situation. The markets don't want to lend to them at any reasonable rate. They're in a crisis, but they have to pay very big bills in terms of importing, for example, fuel, or paying for some of the debt they accumulated in the past. And the IMF comes in to help these countries close that financing gap. In addition to providing financing, we also work with the country in terms of having policies in place that can help this country exit where they are and also hopefully not return. So that's our lending role. And then the last role is capacity development and training. Any country, any of our members can come to us for capacity development. So what does that mean? So we have, for example, some countries, low-income countries, who say, okay, we want to do an inflation targeting rule in monetary policy. How exactly do you do that? What do we have to do? And so the IMF helps on that front. Or you could have countries that's saying, we're thinking of introducing a central bank digital currency. Can you give us some assistance in terms of pros and cons and so on? And so we help on that side too. So these are the three big blocks. And as number 2 at the IMF, I work on all of these different areas. And I have program countries that I oversee, including Argentina and Ukraine, but also do oversee the surveillance work and the capacity development work.
Okay, terrific. Thanks. That's super helpful. So can you talk a little bit about, you've worked on so many of these global economic outlook reports, and given where we are now, things are, there are numbers out there of projections, but what do you see as the big risks on the horizon for the global economy?
Yeah. So firstly, I've been at the fund for a few years now, and starting from 2020 onwards, for the longest time, every time we put out the global economic outlook, world economic outlook, we said the risks are on balance to the downside, because there was always something going wrong. And this time, after a very long time, we said the risks are balanced. So I think that's an important thing to note, that we see the risks as more balanced than we have for a few years now. In terms of the risks, of course, that remain, I think first and foremost, there is, countries have done well in bringing inflation down by a lot, but they are not still back to target. And so there is the final descent, and question is how we get there. Our baseline is that there is a so-called soft landing, which is inflation comes back down to target without much of a disruption in labor, that bigger disruption in labor markets or the economy. Whether that actually all plays out is yet to be seen. So I think that has implications for the world as a whole. The second area that we, of course, are paying very close attention to are just mostly conflicts around the world and developments, including in the Middle East, and what that could imply for commodity prices and therefore consequences for different economies. We're obviously pay attention to many individual economies, including China, which we're going to talk about, and the property sector in China and how that could evolve. But more broadly, in terms of our more kind of baseline concern that we have for the global economy is weak growth. So if you look at our medium-term growth projections, which is our estimate of where we think growth will be in 5 years for countries, that medium-term growth projections has basically shown a secular decline. It used to be about 3.8% for a long time, and now we're at 3%. And this is most countries, and all countries are in that direction. And so the question is, why is that? Of course, some part of it is demographics and aging demographics, but the big chunk of it is something we need to understand well, which is the so-called productivity growth. It's just generally our best measure of productivity growth has shown a declining trend over the last 20 years. What can turn that around? What policies can help? That's where a lot of the discussion is these days, too.
Well, you're here in Silicon Valley,
yep,
where there's quite a few people who think that AI is going to be that force. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how you see the implications of AI in the global economy.
The closer you come to the West Coast, the more you start getting excited that maybe all of this is actually going to deliver huge productivity gains. So we are paying very close attention to AI. It certainly seems very promising. The micro-level studies show some very strong numbers, but to go from there to a macro estimate requires some more assumptions, and there's a whole range of estimates at this point in terms of what the impact could be. Somebody like Daron Acemoglu says we are looking at, in the best case scenario, less than 0.1% increase in productivity per year for the next 10 years. Or on the more positive side is Goldman Sachs, that number is 1.5% every year, which given that productivity growth in the US is 1% on average, not this moment, but on average, that's 2.5 times. So that adding on top of that, so that would be quite something. It is promising. We would love to have different sources of improvements in technology that can generate these kinds of productivity gains and that are very helpful. The analysis that we did in terms of understanding the decline in productivity growth, an important variable has been an estimate of misallocation of resources. So misallocation of resources across firms and so on have played an important role. So that's not a technology story, but in terms of policies that you have to bring about the right allocation of resources. So that can also play an important role.
Great. So you talked a little bit about dollar dominance. Just related to that, we've heard a lot about how the U.S. at least in terms of real GDP growth, has really been outperforming the rest of the industrialized world. We also hear a lot here about the unsustainable fiscal trajectory. Can you talk a little bit about how the trends here, what's happening in the U.S. is influencing the global economy on those fronts?
So a statistic I like to point out is in 2019, before the pandemic, we had our 5-year projection. So we had an estimate of where each country would be in 2024, our projection. In terms of major economies, the only country that has done better than that projection is the US, and by a significant amount. So every other country, the pandemic, the war has taken away some of where we thought the economy would be in terms of GDP. If you look at low-income countries, on average, they are about 8% below where we thought they would be in 2024. The US is on the positive spectrum, right? So it is really quite unique where the US is in terms of its recovery from all of these shocks. And of course, unlike Europe, it was not as affected by the war in Ukraine. What has played an important role is there are a bunch of factors in the US. Fiscal policy has also been quite, I don't know, you use the word stimulative, but there's been generous fiscal policy. Deficits is about, US deficits are about, fiscal deficits about 7% of GDP. The second thing is, which is interesting, which is unlike what we're seeing in Europe, is productivity growth in the US is higher. Labor productivity growth in the US is higher now than, growing much faster, rather, than, for example, many other countries, including Europe and Canada and so on. That's playing a role. Immigration has added to the labor force, and that's played an important role in keeping GDP up and helping with, not showing up in inflation. We looked at data in terms of global capital flows to see, just to track where is the money going. 1/3 of global capital flows is destined to the US, is going to the US. And this is not just portfolio flows, but we're talking about even foreign direct investment. The US is a very attractive destination for foreign direct investment. So if you look at pre-pandemic, 2019, that number was around 18%. So it's gone from, it used to be 18% in terms of gross capital flows, now it's 1/3 of flows. So it's a very attractive destination for investors around the world. In terms of implications for the rest of the world, I think what's good is that the US economy is strong. It absolutely has positive spillovers to the rest of the world in terms of global demand. Just a US economy that has strong consumption demand has positive spillovers to the rest of the world. On the flip side, the fact that the US economy is so strong means that real interest rates are likely to stay higher for longer than we might have thought. And that, combined with the projected path of fiscal deficits for the US and the growth of debt in the US, that combination, by keeping real interest rates higher, makes cost of funding higher for most countries in the world. And obviously, it has implications for currencies.
It's fascinating. Okay, so you mentioned Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. And can you talk a little bit about the economic impact to date and the IMF response to the war, Russia's invasion, and
No, that has had Russia's invasion has had a devastating impact in terms of the impact on humanitarian basis, but also in terms of the economy. Ukraine's economy in the first year of the war shrunk by around 30%, and it has had positive growth of about 4% or so, but it's still 25% below where it was pre-war. So that's a really massive hit to their country. What is really impressive is how the country has managed its macro policies despite having to fight a war. There's been inflation that was in double digits has come down to very low single digits. They've accumulated a large amount of reserves. They moved from, they've got their exchange rate policy that was, I know this is getting a bit technical, but I have to say.
It's okay.
They went from
We can handle it.
having a fixed exchange rate at the start of the war, which is what they moved to going back to having a managed float. So their macro management has been really very impressive. In terms of the consequences, so our engagements with Ukraine is we have a program with Ukraine that we put in place of 2023, early 2023. It's a total package of about $15 billion that goes over 4 years. But what's more important about the program is the catalytic role it plays, which is because of the IMF program, we have several countries, several official donors that find the IMF program incredibly helpful to have so that they can explain why they are giving money to the country too. And so the total package that came alongside our 15 billion, we got commitments from all of the countries in the world in terms of how much money they were planning to put into Ukraine, and that total package is 150 billion. So it gets a bigger number. Now, in terms of the consequences for the world, the biggest effects were felt in some parts. Europe was much harder affected than others, and that was mainly their heavy reliance on energy imports from Russia. If you look at our estimate, for example, for the euro area and how much of GDP we now believe got shaved off following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, ex-Ukraine, that is about 2%. So another example where things were managed extremely well to prevent a much bigger hit on the economy. So it's about a 2% loss. Some countries more worse than the others. Germany was much harder hit than others. For the world as a whole, there was a period when oil prices shot up by a lot. It came down, but it shot up by a lot. That was very costly. Food prices went up by a lot, also because fertilizer prices went up by a lot. Ukraine and Russia account for about a third of the exports of wheat in the world, and that caused food prices to go up by a lot. And so at that time, the IMF also came in and we created a new a lending program called the Food Shock Facility that we were able to give money very quickly to countries that were facing these rapid increases in food prices.
Great, thanks for that. Okay, so I've got tons more questions, but I'm going to ask two more. So in recent years, industrialized countries, including the US, have been more likely to embrace industrial policies that are helping certain industries, often for national security reasons. So can you talk a bit about what challenges that creates for our global trading system?
Yeah. So the way the new forms of industrial policies are working is through providing subsidies to companies. And the WTO, that is a bit of the unfinished business of the WTO, which is coming up with rules on how to deal when countries give subsidies to their firms, right, or support of this kind. So you can see right there that this is a problem because we don't have the rules of engagement when it comes to subsidies. And subsidies are a long-standing issue. It goes back. I mean, there are other countries, including China, who provided a lot of support for their companies for much longer, many more years. But we are in an environment where there is no way to decide what the subsidy means and what does that imply for how countries can respond and so on. So it is difficult. Again, we recognize that there are sometimes good reasons to provide subsidies. For example, if you're looking at the climate transition, you want to encourage new kinds of climate technology, green technology, that providing subsidies can help, and that's all true. But it is absolutely critical at the same time to keep in mind that it's sometimes very hard to identify exactly what the distortion is that you're trying to address. Secondly, you can end up with political capture, and the subsidy can continue forever, can be incredibly fiscally costly. And the third thing, which countries seem to forget, is that when you put such policies in place, and especially if they have a protectionist element to it, you have retaliation. So over the last couple of years, every time the US, China, or the European Union has put a subsidy in place, there's been like a 75% probability that within the next 12 months, one of the other countries puts a subsidy in place too. So this is what we would expect, which is this kind of retaliation. And when you go down that route, that's when you end up with bigger problems.
Okay, I have so many more questions I'd like to ask, but I'm going to end with this one and then open it up. Can you talk a bit about how the IMF is currently thinking about climate change and what, if anything, the IMF is doing to incentivize countries to tackle this challenge more aggressively?
Yes, so climate is an important part of the work that we're now doing. Starting from, I think it was 2021, we actually have a whole climate strategy. So the way we see it, and you might ask, why is the IMF involved in climate work? The way we see it is we have several, firstly, of our member countries, especially small island nations, that they have weather shocks, and that is it. That wipes out significant parts of their economy. They have the standard balance of payment crisis, which is when the IMF goes in, and we need to help them. So there are emergencies, climate emergencies that are macro critical, and we see ourselves in those situations often. We also have other countries where, because of changing weather patterns, their agricultural productivity has declined by a lot, and that's affecting their ability to gain export revenues because they're not able to export as much. That's again affecting their amount of foreign currency they can accumulate and therefore pay for some of their important bills. So this is macro critical in multiple ways. At the IMF, we are helping in many ways. I would mention firstly on the policy front, which is helping countries design appropriate policies for climate mitigation and adaptation. We're also helping in terms of financial stability issues, whether your financial system is resilient to climate-related risks. We're also providing financing on a more longer-term basis, actually, which is a whole new instrument that the IMF has come out with. It has about $41 billion in it right now. We have 18 countries that have programs, have this particular facility, that we're helping countries with funds to implement climate adaptation and mitigation policies.
Great. Okay, so with that, I'm going to open it up for questions, and we've got one right here from Professor Duffy. Sorry, can we get, yeah, thanks, Wendy. Here we go, right here. Yes, yeah.
Thanks, Gita. Great framing of your headline topic. I want to ask about that. BRICS countries and some others view dollar dominance as having risks for them, dollarization, sanctions, secondary sanctions. They're trying to reduce their reliance on the dollar very openly, talking about their own currency, which seems unlikely, but they will, presumably, you already showed some figures, succeed in avoiding some reliance on the dollar, but there's trade-offs. Your presentation didn't really explain those trade-offs. There's causality issues in the trade flows that also affect the use of currencies, but when you drop away from use of the dollar, what are the trade-offs that those countries are facing? What are they giving up on the economic side in order to gain on the geopolitical side that you spoke of?
Yeah. So that's right. I did not speak to the forces the trade-offs in terms of picking it up, right? So yes, firstly, there's a lot of talk from several countries in terms of reducing reliance on the dollar. The reality is much harder in terms of doing it. And the reason is, firstly, network effects are very important. Many of these countries have firms that export who also import. And unless you can get you're going to get a shift in equilibrium where there are a large number of your trading partners that also decide to move to another currency, it's going to be difficult to do that. Secondly, the question is, which currency do you use, right? If you're going to moving away from the dollar, the question is, which one do you use? And then the question is, are we going to use each of us are going to use our own currencies, or we're all going to decide on a particular currency? That doesn't come easily. The second aspect, this is some of the work that I've done with Jeremy Stein, is if you're in a world when you are invoicing in dollars and you're trading in dollars and you're accumulating dollars because you're selling your goods in dollars, that helps you tap dollar funding markets, which is cheaper for you too in terms of your financing. And so from a trade finance perspective, it is also helpful to have your receipts and your invoices all in the same currency. So there is a big network effect. And at the end of the day, ultimately, in terms of to get any kind of a serious shift in equilibrium, you need to have what the US has, which is the US has very deep financial markets, full convertibility of the currency, and the institutions that it does. And at this point, it's hard to think of how some of the new players can replicate that.
Great. Okay, we've got a question right here. Okay, right here in the middle. Yep. Great. Thanks.
That's fascinating. Thank you. My question is, how do you see the role of India emerging? Is there even a bloc beginning to form on the global south, particularly with the recent G20 meetings, how India orchestrated Africa and the inclusion of African continent as part of the formal membership? So how does that begin to affect the economic side of the equation, particularly when it comes to pro-technology forward thinking and large, obviously 1.5 billion population consumer market that's ready to adapt? How do you think that's going to flow into, as well as the implications of AI, which is going to be a mass adoption that will also happen there along with the large youth population? So how do you see, is there a bloc even forming, or where do they belong, or countries associated with India-centric approach?
There are a lot of questions in there.
We would like to ask a couple more.
Yes.
So,
Okay.
so I know that.
Yeah. So firstly, India had a very successful G20 presidency. It put the voice of developing countries, emerging developing countries on a very prominent stage. And as you said, one of the things they did was bring the African Union in as a part of the G20. That was one of the things. Second thing that we did, actually worked with India on through the G20 is G20 presidency, along with the World Bank, is helping countries on their sovereign debt restructuring, the countries that needed to go through sovereign debt restructuring. How can we get those processes to work better? So we created something called the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable. That played an important role. And another very important thing India did was in terms of coming up with some common principles on how to think of crypto and its benefits and costs and potential regulation. So I think it did a lot on that front. It's among the major economies of the world. It is one of the, if not at this point, the fastest growing major economy of the world, and it has a lot of potential. I'm going to stop with that.
Okay, great. Professor Taylor, right here. Okay. Sorry to.
My question is pretty simple. You're an International Monetary Fund. You didn't talk too much about monetary issues. Why? They're so important. The U.S. is going back to 2 maybe, if we're lucky. Other countries get good. Why not have the world be 2%?
2%. Oh, yeah, so I'm happy to answer questions on monetary, on monetary issues.
I'll ask her, why not 2% global?
Well, so firstly, it's pretty cool to be talking to the person who came up with the Taylor rule here. In terms of the appropriate level of inflation that you want to target, of course, there has been thinking on this that goes back. And as you know, emerging and developing countries tend to have higher inflation targets. Part of the reason, one of the arguments would be that they tend to have more they hit more by sudden supply shocks, so you don't want to, as a monetary policy maker, you may not want to intervene at that time and let it pass, including terms of trade shocks that can play a role. So there are countries that tend to have a higher average levels. For example, India is 4% plus or minus 2% to allow for that buffer. There is higher pass-through for them from higher import prices and a weaker currency into CPI inflation. And so that all of that just means you kind of want to have a slightly higher rate. Now, over time, that number has actually gone down. If you look at the average for emerging markets and what inflation levels they've been trying to target, that has come down. And before the pandemic and the war, they started looking more and more like the developed world, but they're still not back there. I think we're now in the world where one could ask the question about, what's the appropriate level of inflation that one should keep. I get asked that question, and as of now, I think what we need to first accomplish is getting back to target. This is not the time to start moving targets when you're, opportunistically. So I think it's important to bring inflation back to your country's target, whatever is it that you had decided it was in the past. And then when you're in that place and in a normal time, then of course you can have all these wonderful debates about where to move the target or not. But you don't want to do anything opportunistically.
Okay, great. I want to see if any questions. I've asked 3 in a row from the middle section. Any questions from over here? Okay, I'm going to. Or no. Oh, sorry, over the right section. How about this gentleman right here with his yeah, over there to the with the.
Thank you so much. Thinking back to your dominant currency paradigm paper from 2020, since then, given everything that's been going on with global markets, has global trade become more or less responsive to dollar appreciation or depreciation?
I don't think much has changed on that front. I think we're still in the same world that I described in the dollar dominance paper. It is, I think, one of the important things that even empirically that you see, that currencies have exchanged, when they devalue their currency or they depreciate the currency, you don't see the export boom that you would have expected in the more kind of Mundell-Fleming world, while you see the import contraction. So that's very much the case. There's also some evidence of, one of the predictions of the dominant currency paradigm is basically that when the dollar strengthens, rest of the world trade as a whole can go down, and there's some evidence for that too.
Okay, right over here, Professor McFall. Then I'll come to you. No, a little closer. Wendy, I'm sorry. No, this is there another Professor McFall?
Well, I don't have a tie on. He should get the question first. I'm Mike McFall. I'm more on the geopolitics side than the geoeconomics. Now, I want to ask one big question and one small question. In a lot of meetings I go to about the blocks that you started with, there's a view that the autocratic bloc is trying to create illiberal economic institutions to take down your IMF, World Bank, the Bretton Woods, the liberal international order. Tell us what you think of that. And I know it's hard for you. You're a government official. You're an official. But tell us how broadly to think about that and maybe dig into some of the details. Tell us a little bit about how you think about like the AIB or BRI. And this broader thing, do they really have these institutions that are adversarial to what you're doing in the world? Or are they orthogonal? Or are they win-win? Tell us your view of that. Yeah. And then secondly, you touched on it on the WTO, but I want you to go deeper on the subsidies piece. Just, what's your view? I mean, I was in Beijing when Secretary Yellen came there, and she's all about overcapacity because of subsidies, and the Chinese say it's all about competition. What's your view on that, and who adjudicates that? Could the WTO ever do it again, or is that world part of the past?
Okay, good luck.
Are we out of time?
Good luck. We may.
So firstly, as an institution, we work with all of the institutions in the AIB, the BRI, the New Development Bank, rather, in the sense that we have cordial relations with everybody, and in a sense, if there are more sources of funding that's going to be available for the world and more sources of safety net, I think that's fine, right? Of course, what we always push for is that whatever lending is done transparently. The terms and conditions on which it's done are transparent. All of these countries that you talk about are part of our IMF board. And I have to say that at one point was worried about how would all this geopolitics affect how we do our business. I would say that on the positive, it's been good. We've been able to get stuff done. and countries put on their multilateral hat even when they're at the fund. So I think that's good. Let's hope it stays that way, but that's where it is. In terms of subsidies, yeah, I mean, the ideal thing would be if countries came together and said, we have had this long-standing issue with countries giving subsidies to companies. We haven't been able to design how exactly do we think about it and what works and what doesn't work. That would be ideal if it came together and that happened, but that's not where the world is. In terms of China, I think first and foremost, China has very weak demand at this point. The economy is one where consumption could be much stronger than what it is right now. It is in an environment where, especially after the pandemic and so on, coming out of it, consumption has not fully recovered. And so there is a low demand environment along with all this production that's coming out. And we've talked about it in our report, and I'm going to China to meet the authorities too about this. So there is, we have flagged very clearly about concerns of overcapacity for sure in the property sector. I mean, there we believe it's a sector that needs to shrink. It has overcapacity, and we have ideas on how to make that transition happen. Then there are these newer sectors where there is discussion on it, and we are discussing with China exactly on assessing, what the level of the capacity is. But I would say our main policy message for China is it's an economy that it needs to be able to support more consumption than it is doing right now.
Okay, I'm sad to say we are out of time. If you have a question, maybe feel free to come up just briefly. She does have to eat dinner at some point tonight, but please join me in thanking Gita Gopinath.
Thank you. Thank you. And before we close, I think we should give an applause to Mark Duggan. This is his last time doing
my last one.
this. Yeah, being director, and I think it's fantastic.
Okay.
Yes?
Okay, yeah, picture, sure.